Okay, so now we get to the fun part.
So, listeners, if you've made it this far through our podcast, thanks. We're going to do something fun now. Basically, as Alana mentioned earlier, she's only had one job interview in her life.
Yeah.
So, we're going to give her another one, and it's for being the co-host of Podditea.
Yeah, so what we did, I think we just came up with this, like, literally yesterday.
Yep.
But what happened was I was like, Janice, you should interview me, and you can pick what job it's going to be. So Janice actually sent me this Word file that is the job description for the Podditea co-host.
Should we read it to people, or will we post it? I think we should post it later.
Let's just post it, because it's like a page long.
Yeah.
She actually, like, really
I wrote a real job description, guys. I really like HR and career stuff, honestly. I think it'd be cool.
So I just read this, like, about an hour before we started the podcast.
Yep.
So I have a general idea of what this job is going to entail. Obviously, at this point, I'm pretending that I haven't been doing this job for the last 2 months.
Guys, if Alana fails this interview, I'll be interviewing new people, so stay tuned.
Yeah. So my job's really on the line here. So shall we start?
Welcome to the interview. It's lovely to meet you, Alana.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to having this opportunity to talk to you.
Please sit down.
Oh, thank you.
So, let's start. Tell me about yourself.
Okay. Well, you obviously already know my name. You received my CV and all of the documents that you requested in your application, so you know a little bit about me. The major things I think you need to know about me is that I think that I fit the required skills really, really well in order to do the job that you requested. So this first skill that you requested is that I have an undergraduate degree, and I do. I have that. I just received it a couple months ago, so it's really fresh in my mind, and I really feel like I've got that skill down. The second thing is podcast editing skills. Now, I have been working on this podcast. It's not very big, but it's going somewhere, and I have been working on editing it. So that's, pretty good. And I do have my own software and everything, so that's great. And ability to get along with Janice. Now, this was a bit of a tough one, but I do have a lot of experience in this field. I actually have known Janice for over 10 years now, and she doesn't hate me, so I think that I really have this down.
Wait, so am I going to critique your answers as well, or am I just, rolling with the interview and giving you questions?
I don't know. Maybe we should do the interview, and then afterward you can critique my answers.
Okay. Alright. Well, following that then, why are you interested in this position?
Oh, I think it would be a really interesting challenge. Like I said, I have been working on this podcast for the last couple months, but, I really want to branch out and do a different podcast and meet some new people, and, I really think that I'd be great at it.
Can you tell me about your previous experience with podcasts?
Oh, sure. So I've listened to a ton of podcasts. Especially recently, I've been listening to podcasts every day for sure, several even. Whenever I walk to and from work, I'm listening to podcasts. I get my information about, the news through podcasts, and so I have a lot of experience just through listening, and I think that that's really useful. And then in terms of making my own, again, it's still a work in progress what I've been doing, but it's a huge learning experience, and getting over that first curve is definitely something that I'm still working on, but something that I think that we're doing pretty well, me and the other co-host of the podcast that I'm doing.
How does listening to a podcast make you a good fit?
Oh, because you can learn so much by the way that you observe other people doing podcasts.
So tell me something you've learned and how you would apply it to this one.
Sure. So one of the podcasts that I listen to is Gilmore Guys, and it's kind of a niche podcast for people who like the show Gilmore Girls, or even if you don't like the show Gilmore Girls. I think what I've learned from it is that they have such compelling personalities, the two hosts of this podcast, that it doesn't even matter if you listen to the show or not, because you want to listen to the podcast just for them. So I've learned from them that if you have a good rapport with your co-host and you are engaging and you make the audience feel connected to you, then that's a really good quality, and that's something that I'm trying to emulate myself.
Do you have an example of building rapport with others and having people drawn to you, listening to you?
Do you mean in terms of just in my own podcast, or do you mean in life in general?
In life in general would work.
Okay. Yeah, so that's actually one of the biggest challenges for me, because I have trouble initiating conversations with people, but what I try to do is, once I am in a conversation, I try to demonstrate to that person that I'm a person worth talking to. And so I like to give, unique opinions, or just try to be as genuine as possible, and I find that often gives pretty good results in that field.
How are you working on improving this, if it sounds like starting conversations is a weakness for yourself?
I don't know if I would call it a weakness. I mean, obviously, if you have to pick a weakness, then definitely taking initiative in that matter is one of them. But I think that figuring that out in of itself can be a strength. So what I do is I try to take an analytical approach to people, because taking more of an interpersonal approach is a lot more difficult for me. So when I am speaking to someone, I think that it's really just a matter of experience and figuring out how I can be comfortable in that environment. And so, like I said, when I take more of an analytical approach, I can kind of step back and observe myself interacting with that person, and I find that that's more of a comfortable way to interacting. And then once you get to know the person, you don't have to do that as much anymore. It's a bit of a crutch, but once you get over the initial hump of beginning that initiation, then things start flowing more freely.
Now with this job, you're going to be having to work alongside Janice, who's notoriously known for singing, for laughing, for being unable to stop laughing, as well as for sometimes getting off topic. Now, is this something you can work with, and what would you do if you found yourself in a case where Janice is laughing nonstop and the podcast has to go on?
Well, there's a couple different questions in the question that you asked. In terms of the problem where Janice might be laughing incessantly, that's fine, because I would be, as I understand it, I would be in control of editing the podcast, so I think I could just let that go on for about 5 minutes and I could cut all of it, and so it wouldn't be detrimental to the podcast whatsoever. And in terms of getting Janice back on track, I can see how that would be a problem, but in order to establish to your listeners that you have a comfortable rapport, like I said, with your co-host, it's almost advantageous to allow your conversations to go off track a little bit, because tangents in a podcast that of the sort that you're looking into, as I understand it, you're allowed to go on tangents, you're allowed to explore different conversations that way, and not stick to a schedule so strictly.
We mentioned in the job description that possibly assisting with marketing efforts would be a component of the job. Is this something you have experience or interest in?
Well, I think that the great thing about with working with Janice is that is her forte. So I don't have a lot of experience with marketing, but I am definitely open to learning that sort of thing, and I think that's something that Janice could teach me when we do this.
I see. And there was also the component about being available for conversations about the podcast at any time and moment. So my question is, how do you manage multiple priorities?
Okay. In terms of managing multiple priorities, I think that having a brain that can multitask is an asset, and I definitely think I have that. I never forget a deadline, even if I don't write it down, and I can always juggle lots of things going on, and I also always have my phone on. So if Janice needs to contact me at any given point, I will definitely be there to respond. Now, of course, I do have other priorities, and occasionally, if, for instance, I am in the lab, I work in a chemistry lab, in that case, I can't pull out my phone when I'm covered in chemicals, but of course, it would be my number one priority once I leave the lab to accomplish the task that Janice has set out to me, which is to respond to her.
I see. Well, I believe that's the end of the interview, unless you have any questions yourself.
Oh, I do have a couple questions. So Janice is going to be the co-host. Does she have any visions for this podcast besides what was outlined in the job description?
That is something you would have to discuss with Janice, because if you get chosen for this role, as it will very much be a collaboration between the co-hosts.
Okay. And just in terms of the amount of time that I would be spending on this, do you have a general idea of how often we would be releasing a podcast and what time I should allot to each of the different components, such as editing and recording?
The idea, I believe, is that the podcast will be released bi-weekly, as in every 2 weeks, not twice a week. So that should have... So and it's alright if there's a delay in when it's recorded and when it's put out, obviously. Hopefully
so you're saying there's a little bit of flexibility in the hours?
Yes, so there's flexibility in the hours. With regards to how long the podcast is, we've been informed that half an hour is optimal. However, if it goes a bit over that, then that's fine. As for editing, that would depend, again, on you and Janice, how the podcast goes, your own skill level of editing, etc.
Okay. I just had one more question. Yep. If that's okay?
Yes.
Okay. What do you think would be the opportunities for growth in this industry, in the podcast industry?
As you may know, podcasting has grown in the last few years. There are many podcasts out there, and this is meant to be unique in the fact that not so much about talking about life after undergraduate, but we're hoping the concept of how the co-hosts talk, bringing their own perspectives, having just been new grads themselves, will make it niche. It's possible this would be platformed on SoundCloud, and hopefully could be sent out to iTunes or Stitcher. As you mentioned, Janice will be in charge of marketing, so she hopes to be working on that very hard and making it big. And of course, part of as we mentioned with marketing, we would be expecting some self-promotions, hopefully. So sharing it with your own friends and family, and seeing how it grows there. In some ways, this is very much an experiment, but we don't see cause for it going wrong.
Okay. I think that's all the questions I had.
Thank you for coming in, and it was lovely to meet you. We'll let you know our decision within the next week.
Within the next week? How about within the next 5 minutes? Because you're going to review my interview.
We actually have a few more candidates to go through, obviously.
Oh, okay, of course, yeah. Okay, thank you so much for having me. It was an honor to meet you.
It was lovely to meet you as well.
Okay. That was so fun. I was actually stressed. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not saying the right thing.
Okay, so with the last question, I think you asked really good questions. I will say, though, with the last one, with the future of growth in the podcasting industry, I think you were trying to be specific about this podcast, but it's kind of like that's also something you could have researched yourself, or you could have demonstrated having researched yourself. I know in this case, that wouldn't be a thing, but I'm saying in a real job interview, it's never bad to look at the industry and where it's going, and to show you have some knowledge on that.
Okay, I was actually referring specifically to this podcast, but I didn't phrase it well, so I hear what you're saying.
What? Tell me about yourself. Again, you got this job description like an hour before that we recorded this, so to be fair, like, I am recognizing that. So how I'm critiquing it is based more of as if you've been you've seen it like way before, you send in a resume and a cover letter, like you've had time to prepare.
Yeah.
So tell me about yourself, like you've said the right information, but I think you could have gone in for the kill a lot faster. You don't necessarily need to be like, oh, as according to the job description, I fit this. Rather, I would be like, well, I have my undergraduate degree. I just graduated in April, and I graduated in chemistry. I have this experience having been working on a podcast myself, actually, with a friend, and due to that, I have the software, and I've been developing my skill set around that. And then the whole Janice thing, I mean, that was fine. Like, I just be a bit more concise.
Okay. So are you saying, like, don't specifically reference the document?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say, well, I fit your job description. I would say, like, oh, I have this, and I've done this, and I've graduated with this. Like, say stuff around the topic, obviously. Like, you didn't do the thing, at least, where you're like, well, I really love puppies, and I have 2 brothers. Like, stuff that's cool, but not relevant.
I have no idea what the right answer is for tell me about yourself. I feel like I just would say what I'm currently working on. When you asked, I was like, I had the document open in front of me, which is why I was like, oh, reference the document. But
no, that was a good idea. I'm just saying I wouldn't necessarily actually say the words in accordance with your document.
Okay. Well, what I was thinking when you sent it to me is if you asked the question, like, why did you apply for this job, I would have said that I feel like I fit your requirements really well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and like, again, I'm not an expert. Again, I've gone to workshops and stuff about how to do this, and I have my own way of answering, but that doesn't mean other ways are wrong. I will point that out too.
Yeah,
so, like,
that makes sense.
Yeah, so what I've been told with tell me about yourself is you want to say, like, stuff that's relevant to the career. So, for instance, with the marketing job I recently had, I said, well, I graduated from university in April with a undergraduate, with a BA in psych. And while I was in university, I developed my interest and passion for marketing and communications, holding roles in student clubs, and as an intern with the university. And I recently graduated from a laureate with a graduate certificate in digital marketing alongside project management and e-commerce.
Okay. So, like, that's a good answer.
Thank you. I'm trying to think. Like, it was very hard. I was coming up with the questions on the spur as well. So the thing is, something I think I tried to lead you, like, I asked about the podcast editing skills, and I asked about, like, being a co-host, right? And you're like, oh, I'm not great at initiating conversation, right? Mm-hmm. So then I tried to lead you into the whole, like, well, what are you doing to improve upon this? So basically something I've been told, there's the question, and you don't always get it, but it's a popular one where they say, well, what's your weakness, right? What I've been told is to try and turn it around, saying, oh, yes, like, I'm weaker in this, but I'm working on improving it, so...
I've already decided what my answer is going to be for what is your weakness. And if you directly ask me that.
Yeah,
but,
okay.
And it's not the, like, being a perfectionist, which is apparently not what you're supposed to say.
No.
And not what I would say anyway. But my answer for that question is that I have trouble taking initiative. And then... what I would say as a follow-up to that is that I would prefer to ask for help than to do it wrong the first time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Good answer?
I think it's okay. I think it's okay. I don't think it's bad. Like, but one thing I got told recently for weaknesses, rather than say that, is say, look at the job description and find something you're weaker in and say how you're doing it. So, for instance, there's a job description where they said, oh, if you have experience in such and such a program, like using a certain software, that's an asset, because it would be expected that you would use the software. Mm-hmm. So what I did before I went to the interview, I looked online to just, like, learn about the software and see if there were training programs available. And then I was like, so then when they asked in the interview, I just mentioned, yeah, I don't have experience with the software. However, I looked at it and I found a training program online, and I realized I've actually worked with software similar to it. So I would hope that I could pick up on it easily.
Okay.
They said to use a skill rather than a trait, and like identify. And they said because if it's a trait, that's something harder to work on in a way. And I kind of disagree. Like, but it can take more time too, right? Like, it's not like, oh, I don't know how to do this training program done. Like, traits are not the same way. But I would also, but I think the more important part is just saying how you would improve upon it, or how you're already trying to work to improve upon it. Because it's not just like, I suck at this, the end. It's like, okay, I'm aware of it, and I'm trying to do something about it.
So this is maybe well, this is definitely related to that, but I don't know how, like, closely related. My attitude towards job interviews is, here's the thing, everyone likes talking about themselves. So if you think about it that way, it's just an opportunity for you to talk about yourself, which you don't really get that much. Yeah. So just like go into it being like, hey, I got to talk about my favorite subject for a little bit.
I will say too, a lot of people find interviews awkward though, because we're in a society, like we're in an individualistic society, so yes, we're thinking about ourselves. And we've gotten better, I think, about talking about ourselves, but people also are worried about being conceived as bragging, as arrogant. So it's a fine balance, too. I'm not saying that's your experience, necessarily. I'm not saying that's mine. But I know for a lot of people, that's a part of it. A part of why people find interviews difficult. Because...
I never would have thought about that. Not that I think that I'm, like... Not that I've never had the worry that I'm arrogant, but it's also because I never really feel like I come across as knowing that much. So I don't really feel like I have that concern. I just feel like, I don't know, it's just like an opportunity to talk to somebody who knows more than you about the thing that you're about to learn.
But the thing is not, for your research interviews, I think it would be more like that. For my job interviews, like I've interviewed with HR, they don't know anything about like the marketing stuff I want to go into.
Okay.
But so then they've asked me questions about like, what are you like working with a team? And then I have to I'll be like, oh, I'm good. I usually do this. And here's an example. Like you always want to try and throw in examples as well. Like I've had jobs on my resume that aren't necessarily in line with what the position is, but the thing is, if I reference it in the interview then it's not as weird. Or it shows I have some knowledge that's like similar to it, even if it's not in the same field. Like, oh, I do have teamwork experience, for instance.
Ugh. You know, this is...
Alana and I've had very different job experiences. Let's go with that. Let's go back to that.
I am so glad that I've had the experiences that I've had and not the experiences that you've had. Not because, obviously your experiences are so useful to what you're doing, but they sound like, for me and my personality and my interests, like, kind of terrifying. Whenever I do stuff like this, when I'm for instance learning about a new project that I'm going to start or something, I just am pretty much always so excited about it. So like when I speak to my supervisors or anything, like obviously at that point you're usually you've already got the job or whatever, but I'm like, okay, what are we going to learn next? Like, what are we going to look into? Like, what are we interested in? And asking questions about like, oh, that's so interesting. Like how did you start learning of like why are you interested in this, and why am I going to be interested in this, and that's the sort of thing that's the sort of question that you ask in research, and the sort of questions that they ask you when you're looking into that kind of position, because I think that the most important thing is that you're going to be dedicated to this one thing that you're going to be working on for the next amount of time.
Meanwhile, for my job experiences, it's been in roles where you have multiple types of tasks and you have multiple possible projects. It's really interesting that it's different that way from Alana's. Because, I'm learning as I'm going. I have been learning as I've been going a lot of the time so far, which is really cool. But a lot of that also happens outside of work. Like, I've definitely taken myself to be learning and reading up on stuff when not at work or at school, and trying to figure out how to do something so I can do it for work. Not that you're not doing that yourself, Alana. Like, Alana's probably keeping up with research in her field and learning about new ways if she's not hearing about it already while in school.
Yeah, like the sort of thing that you're just talking about, like learning about how to do stuff, that is my job.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like I will often sit at the computer for hours figuring out how to do something that I'm planning on doing in the lab. Like, so during my group meetings, that's basically when I learned like what direction I should head in and what I'm doing. And one of my group meetings, I was like, so I'm running this reaction and monitoring it by this one analytical method, and I'm not really sure using this method if my product is present in the reaction mixture. Tell me if any of this doesn't make sense.
It makes sense.
Okay. So then my prof was like, oh, so what you can do is you can use this one type of TLC stain. So TLC is the method that I'm using. It stands for thin layer chromatography. And maybe I'll do an episode that's like, Alana introduces practical organic chemistry and Janice introduces something that you're doing. But anyway, yeah, so I'm running these TLC plates, and he's like, there's a stain that you can use that will give you a better indication of whether your product's there, because the stain reacts with a specific, what you call a functional group, which is like a series of atoms that are on an organic molecule, like that react in a certain way. So he's like, just make this, if you had like this dip. And so we didn't have it in the lab, so I had to make it. And so it requires adding water and ethanol as solvents and concentrated hydrochloric acid to dissolve the crystals that make the dip. And also the crystals are known to be explosive under certain conditions, particularly if they're dried. So like they're kept wet, and by wet I mean with water molecules attached. So they're still crystals, but they're not dry crystals.
Okay.
So I was like, I'm going to make this dip, but I'm afraid I'm going to explode myself and spill acid on everything. So I spent the next hour literally watching a YouTube video on how to like prepare the dip and stuff like that. And it's like, this is part of my work. And then I'm just like, I'm doing this stuff and I'm like, I have the best job. Who else gets to do this? Like, does that sound fun to you? Maybe not. Okay. This is totally a tangent.
Tangent.
Yeah.
Tangent. Well, this episode needed me singing too.
That's true. We did have you singing in the last episode.
Ta-da!
Anyway, yeah, so like what you said, your research, I guess, is done on your own time in terms of marketing and stuff, but mine is kind of like concurrent with what I'm doing at any given time.
Yeah. Like, okay, this goes into a different discussion I want us to have sometime.
Okay, you can say it now, and then I'll maybe cut it, or maybe we'll talk about it now.
Okay, so the idea, basically, it's what's it called? Shoot, I had the term for it. I learned about it in psych. But basically, it's about broad vs deep.
Oh, you wrote that in one of the documents,
yeah, I wrote,
right?
We have a document for content ideas with Podditea. Anyway, so the idea is basically, if you can learn a lot about a lot of different stuff, but the thing is, if you spend the time, like, covering as much as you can, you're never going to be able to go really deeply into something. But if you go really deeply into something, you're not going to be able to cover as much broadly. For instance, Alana is studying chemistry. She's doing her master's, so Alana's going to be going very deep into a subject. Meanwhile, for me, I've done my undergrad in psychology. I've currently learned some marketing stuff. I'm looking into school where it talks about marketing more and design and just digital innovation. And for me, I realized I like working on multiple projects. I like knowing about a lot of different stuff. And I do try to go deep into stuff. I do want to learn what I can. But I have, like, not that Alana definitely has other interests besides chemistry. I just want to make it clear.
Although it's becoming less and less, to be honest. I'm like more and more like, I just want to do chemistry, which is so lame. I'm also knitting something. Does that count?
There you go. But I just, like, for me, I definitely am like, oh, I like marketing right now because I can do design. I love my Photoshop. I can bring my research skills into marketing. And with marketing, you can work on so many different projects. So currently, that's why I'm looking at marketing, because it allows me to have the breadth. That's the concept. Breadth vs fidelity. So just that's a discussion on my mind, and that's kind of reflected in our job experiences as well. Alana, again, has mostly had research experience. Kudos to her. She's won some big awards and scholarships due to that, actually. But anyway, meanwhile for me, I've done a variety of different jobs. I've enjoyed them all to their own extents. And that's not something I necessarily want to stop. I don't want to necessarily find myself only doing one thing. I've had jobs where it's very dynamic environments. There's always something new going on. There's always some new challenge to encounter. But that's fine by me. Maybe I won't be necessarily an expert in one thing or another. But I like covering that spectrum. And that's just me. That's just my personality. And I think I just kiboshed our whole possible discussion into me talking about this.
That's okay.
But yeah, that's a thing with our job experiences too. And maybe that's reflected in the interviews as well, like you said. Like for me, I was trying to think of general questions while fine-tuning it to this interview. And like I said in the past episode, I guess at this point, the more interviews you do, the more experience you get, the more exposure to different questions or possible questions and their variations. A few years ago, it was very popular to ask questions I've gotten asked this question, and I've offered this question to Alana before. If you were shrunk down to the size of a pea and found yourself in a blender, what would you do in order to get out? And these kinds of questions.
Wait, can we talk about? Sorry.
Yeah.
Can we talk about that question for a second?
Can I just say why I brought out that question?
Oh, sure.
I brought out that question because it is one I've been asked, and it was popularized. Those kinds of questions are still found in interviews, though not as common. And it was popular due to the fact that those were the kinds of questions you heard being asked about at Google and other tech companies, tech giants. And people saw those as being what differentiates possible employees in terms of creativity and knowledge. And now you don't hear about them as much because people don't necessarily know why they're asking them or what these answers really serve to measure. So yeah.
Can we have a mini discussion about the question?
Okay.
So you ask it to me. Okay, we're gonna do a redux where you are again the interviewer and I'm again the interviewee. So ask me the question.
If you were the size of a pea and found yourself in a blender, what would you do in order to get out?
Okay. I have a few follow-up questions. Okay. Can I ask follow-up questions? My first question...
I wouldn't ask too many, usually in an interview. Just saying.
Okay. Well, if they're asking that kind of question, they should be expecting a ridiculous answer.
Go for it.
So my first question is, did I just wake up being tiny?
Yeah.
And is there only one of me in the blender?
Oh yeah, there's only one of you.
Okay. Would I be able to fit under the blender spokes so I don't have to be blendered?
I suppose you could, but how are you going to keep yourself down there and not suctioned up?
I don't think that's how it works, does it?
I have no idea.
If there's only one of you, you just get stuck down there. Can we pull out a blender into pee and see what would happen if I turned it on?
You can. I would rather not. I don't know where my blender is, first of all. I don't
actually have a blender here. Okay, the other thing is there a human-sized human that is about to hit the button that turns on the blender?
Yeah, but they don't know you're in there.
Okay, am I still a human with human thinking capabilities?
Yes.
Can I still make sound?
Yes, though remember your vocal cords and stuff are also shrunken down.
Okay, if my vocal cords are also shrunk, are my cells also shrunk?
Everything's shrunk.
So, if I have the same number of cells in my body, but they're all about a 100th of the size that they already are, would they function? I feel like no.
Alana, that's not the point of the question.
Well, are they interviewing a scientist?
I don't know what I'm interviewing. I was interviewing you for co-host, remember?
Yeah. But if they want to know what kind of person they're getting, I think that an indicator would be if the person is willing to challenge the question.
True.
I think that's just as valid of an answer as having an answer, because the only real answer is to commit yourself to the void.
The void.
Yeah, because you can't get out. If you have the strength of a pea and the ability to communicate with people outside of the blender to the extent that a pea would be able to, then you have no chance. Your chance is to hide under the blender spokes or die.
Or die.
Because even if you jumped, you wouldn't be noticeable to the person who's about to turn on the blender. So the only other option, I think, is to challenge the question. That's how I would do it. How did you answer?
I don't remember, because this was second year, I think, of university for me. So 3 years ago.
Wow. That's a ridiculous question. One of my housemates from when I was an undergrad once told me that she did an interview where they asked the question, if you could be a kitchen appliance, what kind of kitchen appliance would you be? I think she said that it should be a microwave, because it can basically do anything. It can accommodate pretty much anything.
I'm trying to think of what I would be. I think
it'd be a fridge.
That makes sense.
Hold all the things in, keep them together, keep them from degrading. I may have also just glanced at my fridge and that was the first thing I saw.
I think I would be a kettle.
Okay.
Either a kettle or a toaster oven. And that's partially the fact that
you have one job, but you do it well.
Well, with a toaster oven, you can do a lot of stuff. Depending on what temperature.
Well, what you can't do is make a toaster oven. Yeah, you can do a lot of stuff with a toaster oven.
Ooh, or I could be a rice cooker.
Does even fewer things, but does it even better?
But rice.
Alright, so I think that we should wrap up the podcast.
Yep. Well, everyone, thanks for listening to that bonus podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.
Before we leave, Janice, did I get the job?
Oh, did Alana get the job? Well, I really don't want to go into the worries of having to find someone else to co-host this with, as well as to edit it, so I guess you get the job.
So I'm glad that I'm keeping my job, and I'll be sure to uphold the standard that we have come to expect from us, which is pretty, questionable as it is.
Oh, last-minute tips from Janice about interviews. If you provide references, make sure you email your references so they're aware that they're being used as a reference. If possible, try to keep in regular touch with references, and not just about job interviews, just about life in general, so they don't feel like you're just using them. Also,
that's a good point, and something that I always feel awkward about when I'm talking to my potential references.
Same.
I'm like, I actually care about you as a person too, but right now I need you to help me.
Yep. Same, and something else possibly depending on how close you are with them, and if you're just interviewing for one job or you're applying to several, you might want to tell them the nature of the jobs you're applying for, so if they find themselves actually being contacted, they can answer questions properly.
Oh, also for reference letters, if you're applying for scholarships and things like that, if they're not talking to your references directly, one of my profs actually told me that you can just write your own reference letter and send it to them, and then they can use that as a template, or they can just sign it, and that makes their life a lot easier.
Oh.
I've never actually done that before because I don't know how to write a reference letter.
I think I would know how to write a reference letter. I haven't done it, but I think I would be okay too. I've been asked to be people's references, so
maybe we'll do a different pod on that. But next podcast is going to be like a fun one for sure, because this has been a little heavy.
Dum dum dum. Anyway, tune into our social media, because we'll be posting on it a lot more, especially considering how I'm waiting to hear back about jobs, and I'm applying for jobs, and my program's ended, so I have more time.
Yeah, so you'll be hearing a lot more from us, and if you want to continue hearing from us, you can follow /
love us,
subscribe
on Tumblr, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter under the handle Podditea.
Podditea. I finally learned how to spell it, so that's great.
Ta-da!
Okay, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.
Bye! Okay, but the pot thing is just weird. You're more likely to burn it in a pot.
Yes. Okay, that's true. But if you can cook, you can burn anything.
True.
This podcast should just be named "You Can Burn Anything."
There we go.